Welcome back to our series on Iowa farmland leasing. I'm Kelvin Leibold, the Area Farm Management Field Specialist in North Central Iowa. And today we'd like to talk about our third issue, and that's legal and written issues. This is third in our six-part series. Well, there's a strong preference for written leases. There's several reasons why. And amongst those is the whole idea of lease termination notice. Iowa law requires you to send the notice to the name and address on the lease. So again, that's just part of the basics of helping with communication. The other thing is that the lease really provides the framework for your understanding of what each party agrees to. Iowa does have some things as far as the Iowa Code and leases. You can't have an oral lease that's more than 1 year long. Yes, you can have an oral lease that renews itself every year, but you can't have a multi-year oral lease. We see some leases that are longer. We see some with beginning farmer tax credits up to 5 years in length. We see others that involve tenants sharing in the cost of tile or lime, and that may result in a multi-year lease. The Iowa Code does require a lease of 5 years or more to be recorded at the county courthouse. And again, like so many things, why should we have a written lease? And I would say is that, well, it helps us with selective memory and selective hearing, a little bit like marriage perhaps at sometimes, and again, it makes sure that all the different issues are covered that you want to try to cover. Iowa courts have gone in and basically define what the meaning of different terms are so that we both have the same vocabulary, we both understand the same things. And so hopefully if you have a good written lease, it'll allow you to have a better relationship rather than worrying about what the other party has agreed to do and what you remember. Some of these things are that we deal with are like fencing, okay, and fencing law is actually older than the state of Iowa. So those are issues that people need to understand. And there's some interest in hunting rights these days. Probably the one that's garnered the most attention is the crop residue or corn stalks, and that relates to either corn stalks being used as bedding, but really the big one was the increase in the 2 ethanol plants, cellulosic ethanol plants, that require thousands of tons of stover. So who owns that stover? Well, the Iowa Code says that the tenant owns the stover unless the lease says otherwise. Well, we've gone in, the Ag Decision Maker has 2 different leases that you can download off of there. They're actually fillable PDFs. And we went back in and looked at the wording on those and went through them line by line, word by word. And so now I think we've got a good job of matching up on the corn stover residue issue. We simply state that that belongs to the landlord unless the landlord gives permission for the tenant to do something with that. So help prevent misunderstandings ahead of time is critical. Well, as we've seen these rents move along, we want to make sure that these high rents get paid, I guess. There's still some things that can happen along the way, but again, trust is a big thing, and knowing your tenant is another. Make sure you know who you're actually renting to. That'd be another reason for having a written lease. Just because you rent to Jim Smith doesn't mean that you're actually renting to Jim Smith. You may be renting to Jim Smith's limited liability company, or you may be renting to one of his other organizations. So you need to be able to terminate the lease, and so that makes you need to know who's actually on there. And again, the lease termination notice has to be accurate as far as the legal description, so those are all parts of the lease that should show up. We've seen in Iowa a push towards more rents up front. I think we're now over 50% of the rents require the cash rent to be paid all up front the 1st of March. That hasn't been that big of a challenge with low interest rates, but if interest rates would rally, that again would add costs to the system because the tenant's got to borrow money. Irrevocable letter of credit from the lender is one way to go, but lenders tend to think about that as being a loan with no interest rate, and lenders don't like loans that don't have an interest rate. You can require the landlord's name to be included on the payee on the checks. You'd need to go around and get a list from the tenant of all the places he's going to sell crops, and then you need to notify them. So that doesn't work out so well. One that you really should consider, and I'm surprised at how often it is not done, is the landlord lien. Okay, and so this is a way of recording a lien against the tenant. The tenant doesn't have to sign the form. Landlord's lien is different than other liens in that it's a priority lien. It allows you to jump ahead of the bank, even though the bank was on first there ahead of you, and so it's a very powerful lien that allows you to jump ahead of other creditors. So you might want to consult with your professional legal person in that regard. The farmland lease termination notice. We terminate a lot of leases, but we also renegotiate them. Average lease in Iowa is about 20 years. Now, most of those are 1 year at a time, but they get renewed. My farm in Franklin County, I'm approaching close to 20 years with that one. But just recently we changed the lease over to my prior tenant's son, so I'm running to the next generation at this time. So just because you terminate the lease doesn't mean you have to have it signed by September 1. A lot of people go back and wait and roll it back. Also, if you've got a signed lease, it doesn't mean that you can't renegotiate it anytime if both parties want to. We saw some leases that never really got signed this year. Both parties just said, well, let's wait and see what happens with this fall crop and this fall price. But the Iowa Code says that if you don't properly have notice of termination prior to September 1, that it extends for the same terms as the current year. So that's an issue here when we see volatility where people need to pay attention. Farm lease termination is a rather formal process in Iowa. It was amended in 2016 because of a court case. We had a situation where the landlord claimed that the lease was terminated by oral notice, and the tenant agreed that that was the case. And the judge actually ruled, so we have one case where a lease was terminated by an oral agreement. That got the notice of the legislature fairly quick, so we went back and amended the legislation and said, no, we're not going to have any notices by oral methods. We're going to require one of the other ways. And so we've got several other ways that you can terminate a lease. And one of those that's probably the most common is the certified U.S. mail. So we really don't often want to go out and terminate in person. We may not want to publish that in the newspaper saying that, I want to get a new tenant, or I'm not going to rent the farm anymore. So certified U.S. mail is probably the most common. Keep that little green receipt so that you've got proof of when it was filed. Really good publications on the Ag Decision Maker website. We've also got some publications on the Center for Ag Law and Taxation that go into more detail about this type of publication. If you go to the Ag Decision Maker webpage, do a search for Improving Your Farm Lease Contract. That's file C2-01. So just in the upper search box there, put in C as in Charlie 2-01, and that'll pull up the publication called Improving Your Farm Lease Contract that talks about different types of leases and termination. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you on the next videos.